Hi there. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I made the kick drum for this track. Now, this track is a remix I'm doing for a good friend of mine called Bob Holroyd. I'm doing a remix alongside Kasim, T. Williams, and Alex Soren. I'm going to play you a little bit of the track, and then I'll go into the kick drum synthesizer, which is Kick 2, as well as the processing I used after the fact. Let's begin. All right, by the time you're watching this, the track might actually be out. So it's called Bob Holroyd Brushed Aluminum Kolani Remix. So feel free to go ahead and listen to the actual track on Spotify or get a hold of it from Beatport. So onto the kick drum. It's actually quite simple. I'm using Kick 2, as you may have guessed from the previous videos. Again, fairly soft transient. I'm starting at a very low frequency for a transient over here, just under 2K, and I'm decaying fairly linearly down to 44 Hertz within 120 milliseconds. This is generating all of the low mid-range punch. Now the amp, starting with attack immediately, but only at about halfway in terms of volume, and then rising to full volume around there, then dipping the volume again a little bit, just because I feel like I wanted to create a little bit of space for the kick to come back up for the low mid-range frequencies here. This is also to do with the fact that I feel like around here, around 150 to 200 Hertz, the kick drum can sound quite boxy. So if you look at this time at around 10 to 20 milliseconds, that's where we're hovering over 150 to 200 Hertz. And that's exactly where I've dipped it over here between 10 and 20 milliseconds. Then it's rising back up for the 100 Hertz and down from around 30 milliseconds, and the kick ends fully within around 300 to 400 milliseconds. I've also got a click. This is just a sample that I've laid on top of the sine wave pitch sweep, and this is just generating a little bit of a transient, which sounds like this. A nice soft transient to go alongside the kick to make up for the fact that there's no high frequencies present from the sine wave oscillator. All right, that's really it in terms of kick 2. There isn't much more going on. Now, you may have noticed the distortion is on, but it's actually not being applied at all. I do have an EQ on with the low mid frequencies again around sort of 200 Hertz being dipped a bit, but that's standard for a kick. Those frequencies sound very boxy. Whenever you can, dip them slightly. Now, I'm actually applying some reverb into this kick. Now, in some of the previous videos, I showed you how to make a techno kick drum using reverb. Now, of course, this isn't a techno kick drum. Therefore, the reverb is quite short and very mellow, but it's still there and it still helps thicken those low frequencies of the kick and make it a little bit more oomphy, I would say. Now, as you can see, I've high cut, which means the input to the reverb is actually only the low frequencies, the really low frequencies. And then what I'm doing is also low passing, or rather high shelving, so cutting off all of the high frequencies of the reverb output. Now it's quite short at around 600 milliseconds, and the dry wet is around 55. Now you might say, well, don't you want the kick to be more present than the reverb? Normally I would, but this reverb is going to be very, very quiet by default, because only the low frequencies of the kick are being inputted, and I'm still cutting out the high frequencies that are being generated by the reverb on the reverb output. So just keep that in mind. Here it is with just the reverb. You hear that's just a little bit of noise in those low mid frequencies. And here it is back with 55%. And now I'll toggle the reverb on and off so you can hear the difference that it's making. You see how on the really low sub-fundamental frequency of the kick, without the reverb, it's very prominent and it doesn't sound quite molded, right? And what I mean by that is if you play it within the context of the track, it's going to be clearly audible that there's that sub-fundamental frequency from the kick occurring on every single kick drum. With the reverb, that's kind of masked. And I like that because it helps the kick sit in the track a little bit better. There's no one frequency that's poking out too much. Even though it exists, it's sitting quite nicely in the track. Finally, I have Neutron 3 by Isotope, and this is just an EQ to sculpt the reverb even further. So I'm boosting those low frequencies, especially the ones generated by the reverb. Then I'm dipping again the low mid-range because once again, this is where the kick starts to sound quite boxy if there's too much energy. So I'm dipping those. I'm dipping the sort of high mid frequencies, and I'm boosting the very high frequencies just to bring back a little bit of the transient that we may have lost by dipping these over here. Finally, I've got a transient shaper where I'm softening the attack ever so slightly. And again, this just helps the kick sit nicely in the mix and not be too sharp. And in terms of a progressive house kick, this is generally what I do. I have a kick without too many high frequencies, without a sharp transient. I add a little bit of reverb, very tiny amount, very low pass as you can see, just to help the kick sit in the mix. And then I finish it off by sculpting it with some EQ, and I almost always use a transient designer to soften the attack. Now you might ask, well, haven't you been doing that all the way through? Kind of. I don't have too many high frequencies on the kick inherently, but I do have a sample that does contain some high frequencies. The attack doesn't start at max volume, but it does start immediately just at 56% volume. So it's still there. So adding a transient designer can still help me soften the overall attack that is being generated by a combination of the sample, of the oscillator, of potentially the reverb adding some high frequencies. And that's why I always add it. All right. I hope you've learned something from this video. Go ahead and start creating your own kick drums. That is the best way to learn by far. Apply your own types of processing and just experiment. The more you experiment, the more you'll train your ears to know what sounds good and what doesn't, and what works and what doesn't. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.